Okay, thanks, Kate. For those of you who don't know what I do, I am a social science research leader, and yes, I'm in the People and Ecosystems program, which is Program 1 in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies. I'm also a political geographer, and I spend most of my time thinking about the increasingly complex governance of iconic ecosystems, including coral reefs. So I probably don't need to put up this slide for this audience, but most of the talks this morning have underscored that we urgently need better governance of the world's coral reefs. In the last 2 decades, we've seen 3 unprecedented episodes of global or mass coral bleaching, and it's now generally agreed that coral reefs have entered a new period called the Anthropocene. So the capacity of coral reef environments and the many millions of people who depend on those coral reefs, the adaptive capacity of those environments and those people depends upon effective governance. And for people like me, for social scientists like me and the people I work with in the centre and outside of the centre, the big question is how can we design better governance for reefs and other iconic ecosystems in an increasingly challenging world? And the answer increasingly in the literature, the social science literature, the social ecological systems resilience literature, and in policy practice itself is that governance must be polycentric. So for those of you who don't study governance or think about this or have never even heard of the concept, polycentric governance is not new. It dates back to prior to World War II. Karl Polanyi wrote a very famous book on the planned nature of the free market. It was then popularised in the 1960s by Vincent Ostrom, who was a public administration scholar in the US, and in some seminal studies on the organisation of metropolitan governments in the US. But it became really popular in 2010 when Eleanor Ostrom, who was Vincent's wife and also a Nobel Prize winner, suggested that polycentric governance might be the feasible alternative to the failure of top-down climate mitigation regimes, global climate mitigation. And since then, there's been exponential interest both in social science, resilience studies, socio-ecological system studies, and in policy practice itself, in the idea and the practice of polycentric governance. So what is polycentric governance? Polycentric governance involves many autonomous organisational units operating at multiple overlapping scales through processes of mutual adjustment, self-organised cooperation and conflict resolution, producing or manifesting in an overall system-like behaviour within a governance regime. And there have been many different studies and applications of polycentric governance to large-scale and complex environmental governance regimes. In the marine governance realm, we've seen polycentric governance applied as a way of understanding and as well as a way of improving governance of the Coral Triangle and of the Great Barrier Reef, climate mitigation in the European Union, climate adaptation across cities globally, water adaptation in freshwater, large-scale freshwater ecosystems in Brazil, California and the Great Lakes, and within forest policy under the Global REDD scheme. And what these applications and studies of these applications tell us is that polycentric governance has both advantages and disadvantages. So in terms of advantages, I just touched on this before, it's seen as the feasible alternative when top-down solutions have failed. It's also seen as more representative and legitimate because it involves multiple bottom-up opportunities. Because it also involves multiple bottom-up opportunities, it entails more opportunities for innovation and experimentation, for tailor-made solutions at more local scales which are fit for scale. And the overall polycentric system itself is regarded as more flexible and nimble than a brittle top-down command and control system. And it's also regarded as more robust. So when one part of the system fails, another part of the system can come in and take its place. But there are also documented disadvantages. Leakages, inconsistencies, gaming, free riding, spillovers, high transaction costs, poor accountability or accountability that's limited in terms of its visibility, inertia and conservatism in the system, fragility of certain parts of the system, and ultimate lack of design control. But overwhelmingly in practice and in the science, it's generally agreed that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. Polycentric governance is the way of the future. What these studies also show us are many excellent analyses of the initial design and emergent structure of these polycentric governance regimes. And you can see lots of images that look like this in scientific papers, social science papers, which try to map out the essentially network structure of a polycentric regime and talk about different types of structures in terms of strength and so forth. But there are some problems with where the field is at the moment. So one of the problems is that many of these are snapshot studies of the early days of success of polycentric governance. They're also dominated by a structural approach. So there's a lot of talk about who talks to who in the zoo in a polycentric governance system in terms of which organisational units are collaborating with other ones at what levels and so forth. But there's not much talk about how they're doing that, what kind of policy instruments they're using, funding mechanisms, accountability mechanisms and so forth. And there's also an inherent assumption that these polycentric governance systems do remain or maintain robustness over time. So the question for me in this paper was really to deal with that last assumption about robustness, which I think quite a few people have mentioned robustness this morning in different ways. But for me, the question as a social scientist is, do polycentric regimes remain robust over time? And if not, how can we improve their robustness? So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Polycentric governance is clearly popular and it's the way of the future, but how can we enhance the robustness of these complex regimes? So, in the social sciences, we talk about critical cases. So critical cases are cases that are usually single cases, but they're so well studied and they're so rich in data and they're so important that we can generalise to theory from one single case. And the polycentric GBR regime is a critical case. So most people already know this, but I'll just quickly run through why it's a critical case of polycentrism. It's both a local and a global icon. It's an acclaimed multi-level regime. It involves not only the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and the authority and the arrangements around the marine park, but also the industrial development and the governance of that industrial development along the edge of the regime, water quality arrangements, policies, plans and so forth, and even extending to climate change. So when I think of the GBR regime, I don't just think of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority and what happens within the bounds of the marine park under the Act. I think of the regime as all of the governance mechanisms that are designed to influence and regulate the changing impacts on the GBR. And that is the polycentric regime. It's also a long-standing regime. It's been in place for at least 43 years, so it gives us a really good example to study a regime longitudinally. And most commentators would agree that today it exhibits a relatively polycentric and outwardly stable state. So methods, just quickly. First, we undertook an institutional analysis of the broader regime structure through stakeholder interview, triangulated with an analysis of the many, many different inquiries, reviews, reports, assessments and audits of all the different aspects of the regime over the last 43 years. We then undertook key informer interviews with experts on the effectiveness of the regime, triangulated that with participant observation data from government and scientific meetings, as well as those desktop sources I mentioned before. And then we also undertook process tracing of the broader regime context. So, for instance, looking at key industry economic data over the last 40 years and then triangulating that with key agency data, including employment and economic data in budget reports and annual reports. And one of the beauties of studying this kind of governance regime in the Australian system is Australian agencies are very good at producing this kind of data and putting it in the public domain, so it's all publicly accessible. Okay, so let's talk about the results, first concentrating on structure. So what we see with the development of the regime structurally over time is a fairly predictable increase in structure over time from the beginning, the introduction of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act in the 1970s, the World Heritage listing a few years later, and then a process of what political scientists call layering or thickening, when different acts and regulations, policies, plans, programs and different organisations move into the regime to deal with emerging issues for the regime, like coastal management, water quality and so forth. So that was really the first 30 years or so of the regime. The regime, in terms of structure, eventually stabilised around the mid-2000s, essentially at the time of the successful rezoning in 2004. And you can see this here in a graph which charts the... so like I said before, I'm not just talking about the Goodroompa and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park regime, but this graph neatly illustrates the stabilisation of the growth and then the stabilisation of the regime around the time of the rezoning in 2004. So we have funding for Goodroompa on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side the number of Goodroompa employees from 1975 through to 2015. These perceptions of the structural stability of the regime were reinforced by a number of different government reports in recent times too. So Dave will probably talk a little bit more about this in the next talk, but for those of you who don't know, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority produces an outlook report every 5 years, which is a very important scientific outlook for the reef, but it also includes a chapter on the management effectiveness for the Great Barrier Reef, which is always produced by an independent group. And in 2014, that report said that a sound system of governance, stakeholder engagement and other management processes is in place. In 2015, when the World Heritage Committee decided to instigate a reactive monitoring mission in concern to some developments along the edge of the reef as a result of the expansion of the liquid natural gas industry, the State Party report, which is the Australian Government report to the World Heritage Committee, stated that a strong foundation of existing protection and management of the property remains firmly in place and continues to be built upon. And soon after, the Reef 2050 plan, which the Australian Government in conjunction with the Queensland Government produced in response to World Heritage Committee and other concerns, also stated that combined, the body of law comprehensively protects the Great Barrier Reef. Governments are regularly reviewing and updating legislation to ensure that new threats and issues are efficiently and effectively addressed as they arise. But when we look at context, so we move from looking from structure to the structure of the regime to the context of the regime, what we see around that time of the structural stabilisation, which was the time of the very successful rezoning in 2004, for which I should mention that the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority has won many, many awards for, we see some major contextual changes on the edge of the regime. So an unprecedented mining boom in Australia, in both Queensland and Western Australia, increased the external stresses for the regime, and then a few years later the global financial crisis saw regime agencies across the board freeze budgets. When this happens, so when a regime stays the same but the context for the regime changes, political scientists call this regime drift. Now, in this paper we isolated 10 types of regime change over the next 10 years. This first phase of regime drift was very low in visibility. Most people didn't really see that it was happening, even people who were participating in the system. But it paved the way for a more moderate level of regime change a few years later, more moderate in terms of visibility. In particular, the introduction of the environmental offsets policy under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. At this stage, when we interviewed experts about the regime and its effectiveness, experts said at this stage they were starting to worry that the regime was being converted, that while the structural stability of the regime still appeared constant, the same actors were still in place and they seemed to be doing the same kinds of jobs. They were concerned that the goals of the regime were being redirected from conservation of the GBR to sustainable development of the GBR. And then in the later stages, the most recent phase, which we all know has been very controversial politically, we moved to a phase of much more high visibility changes, and it was a phase of a lot of push and pull, both positive and negative changes for the regime. Where the regime was also, still in a phase of potential conversion, but also realignment due to pressure being put on the Australian and Queensland governments by voters, international NGOs, World Heritage Committee international media and so forth. And, you know, I don't have time to go into all of these different types of regime change, but in this high visibility period, probably the most controversial one was the repeal of climate policy in Australia. But also under the Newman government in Queensland, we also saw a lot of repeals of vegetation management and other types of arrangements. So, in terms of overall analysis of the structure of the system, to the untrained observer or the casual observer, what you see is, so these are different time periods from the early stages of the regime in the 1980s and 1990s. The middle diagram represents what the structural formation of the regime looked like at about 2005, and then the last diagram looks like what I would say it represents what the regime is today. So, to the casual observer, looking at these diagrams and not spending too much time thinking about what they tell you, you still see the same amount of actors in the same kinds of places, involved in sort of networked collaborative type arrangements. And at the time of the rezoning, which is the initial diagram, the first diagram on the left, we see what social scientists think about when they think about ideal polycentric governance. So delegated authority at the local level, which is the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, working in conjunction with other levels of government and concerned stakeholders. The second diagram shows things had started to change. So to the casual observer, it looks fairly similar, but what you can see if you spend more time looking at it is that the Australian government, due to political backlash after the rezoning at the federal level, the Australian government tried to assert a few more powers over the delegated authority at the regional level, and that's indicated by the increasing size for the national government in the diagram. So what we see here are feedback effects on structures, or political backlash at the federal level has a feedback effect on the structure of the regime. Then currently what we see here is that the polycentric regime has actually started to fragment into two regimes, where we have a regime that's fairly obvious at the national level involving the usual players, and then a different set of actors operating at the international level involving the World Heritage Committee, international NGOs like the World Wildlife Fund, and the international scientific and media community, providing a level of oversight and pressure that wasn't there before. So the interesting thing here for social scientists who spend a lot of time trying to set up governance arrangements and study governance arrangements, idealising that first diagram, is that the last diagram was actually and that structural arrangement was the arrangement that actually helped realign the regime and put the regime back on track. And in this regime, it wasn't about local or regional collaboration with the traditional stakeholders that these regimes normally engage with. It was actually about extra local collaboration with international actors. And it was also about conflict. So it wasn't about smoothing over conflict and trying to resolve conflict. It was actually about using conflict in a healthy way. And as social scientists, we tend to try and ignore that. As natural and physical scientists, I've noticed, tend to feel very uncomfortable about that. But I think that's a big gap going forward for us to work with in this space as the governance of iconic ecosystems becomes more and more contested. So I just want to talk a little bit more about context and effectiveness before I finish up. So I mentioned earlier that we tend to, when we think about governance regimes, we tend to spend a lot of time thinking about the structure of them, like who talks to who in the zoo. We don't spend enough time thinking about how that structure then relates to the context of the regime, or the changing context of the regime, and also the effectiveness of the regime. And possibly this is because we spend a lot of time looking at the initial stages of a regime, so the period of regime growth. But when you actually start to look longitudinally, for instance, at this particular case, you see that structural stability in a regime can actually mask changes in context and effectiveness. And low visibility reductions can actually pave the way for more moderate and higher visibility reductions later on. So that's something we also need to think about in our celebration and application of polycentric regimes. That they're particularly vulnerable to contextual influences and these low visibility reductions in effectiveness. So what does that mean pragmatically going forward in polycentric governance? It means that we need to pay more considered and deliberate attention to forecasting and managing for how emerging events might change the values and the influence of key actors over time. And we also need to think more strategically or foresee and then plan for these risks relating to the 10 types of regime change that we identified. And these all point to a need for more extra structural understandings. So polycentric governance is not just about structure. Our interviewees told us time and time again, it's about the independence of the core agency from politics and exogenous pressures. It's about the implementation resources to achieve the goals of the regime. It's about the flexibility of the regime to reassess and update at regular points in time to reflect changes in context. It's about consistency with other organisations and policies that interact with the regime. It's about full use of the available regime mechanisms. So there was a time, I won't go into the details, you can read the paper if you want, where some of the mechanisms that were available to manage some of the effects on the edge of the regime were deliberately not used. And it's also about making sure there are always empowered and independent watchdogs in any regime, so that if the regime does get into trouble, that these watchdogs, whether they're the World Heritage Committee or whatever, can come in to oversee and point out some of the issues. And more recently, I've just added this morning, I think, given some of the talk today and some of the developments in Australia recently, there needs to be more detailed consideration of the science and accountability mechanisms underpinning public-private partnerships and also of their scalability in polycentric governance. We're going to see more and more of this and we need to think about it very systematically. So, going forward, understanding robustness in polycentric governance regimes, it's not just about structure, it also needs to be about the geographic, environmental, economic and political drivers of change, the context, and the effectiveness, the authority and ability of those key actors and instruments to achieve the regime goals. And we can't move forward with polycentric governance unless we manage to endogenise these considerations into our understanding of polycentric governance. Thank you.